Every single Christian has to deal with the issue of power. And we have to ask the question this morning, how are we going to deal with the issue of power? At some point in your life, you are going to have power over someone, even if it's a little tiny baby, an employee, a colleague. If you're in law enforcement, you are charged with the use of power, even force, and so you will confront those kinds of questions. Every Christian will also confront the reality of powerlessness, helplessness. When you are in the power of someone else and you cannot change that fact. Every Christian finds him or herself in both positions at different points in life. And sometimes we find ourselves in those conflicting positions at the same time in life around different issues. So we are unpacking a principle of Christian living and a principle of becoming like Christ in this section of Ephesians. The principle is this: that all believers are to submit to one another mutually. And this is how we become like Christ. Christ is filling his church. He's filling the church with his presence, moving from one relationship to the next. And as he does that and his Spirit takes over these relationships, they become characterized by Christians submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Ephesians 5 and verse 21. And Paul has been unpacking how this looks. What does it look like to be filled with the Spirit between husbands and wives? What does it look like to be filled with the Spirit between children and parents? And so we've been talking about how this principle expresses itself in all sorts of different relationships. And we come now to the most extreme relationship of power in the Ephesian church and in our church. And that is the relationship between masters and slaves. We need to face the extremity of the power relationship in Ephesus. And in ancient times in general, we need to really take in what Paul is saying about that extreme disparity between masters who have literally the power of life and death over other human beings and slaves who are in the power of their masters. Nothing is more tempting in America to pretend that this passage doesn't exist. Nothing is more tempting than for me to get up here and say, well, this is about you and your employer. You should work hard for your employer, and employers, treat your employees right. That is not at all what this passage is about. It does not apply in that way to us today. I've had to teach this passage in a variety of circumstances. At one point, it was a privilege of mine to be pastor to a lot of men who were on parole, serving out their probation in a home for recovering addicts from alcohol and drugs. And so they would sit in my church because they had to be there. They were compelled to walk down the street to our church because it was a Christian ministry working with the state of California in this way. And as tempting as it is to imagine that there is nothing like this kind of relationship today in the United States, I'll just give you that one example. Anyone who has been through the criminal justice system, has served time in prison, and is out on probation or parole is in the power of another person in a way that is extreme. They are economically disenfranchised. They are in tremendous distress in terms of every move they make being monitored, and at any moment a wrong step lands them back in prison. And so they serve masters, and we can argue whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent. We can argue the need for it. We can argue all of that, the ins and outs of that, till we're blue in the face. But the fact is, when you're sitting there with men who are in that kind of relationship with our government, this passage becomes a little hard to teach. Because what you have to say to them is, you have masters. And in your condition, you are called to a certain kind of life, a certain kind of ethic. And so I have taught it in those kinds of circumstances. I have also seen the results when they do. And I'll tell you about that as we proceed this morning. So we are talking about here the master-slave relationship in ancient society. And as we talk about it, we have our own history to confront with this passage, and we will talk about that as well. We have world history to confront with this passage, and we will talk about that. So a pretty heavy agenda here this morning. Let's look at this relationship. I have this picture here from Boccioni, Umberto Boccioni, from 1914. It's called The Street Pavers. He was a socialist, perhaps a Marxist. I have to check that out. But he wanted to portray literal back-breaking work, manual labor, and glorify it. I think he succeeds here. But he's also doing it to raise justice questions. And so we cannot escape those, and we cannot escape the questions of power and economic power in a passage like this. So I won't keep you in suspense. Here's my proposition to you from this passage this morning. Jesus is taking over the world with his power. Let me say that again. Jesus, the one who died for us, is taking over the world, is taking it over right now with his power. And he is going to bring justice. And we have to confront that. We also have to confront the fact that his return has not happened yet. And we live in a fallen, oppressive, unjust, and violent world. And so what we're going to do with this is talk about what Jesus' power did to this master-slave relationship in the ancient world. A slave in the Roman Empire was most likely, in Jesus' time, in Paul's time, someone who had fallen badly into debt and could not repay their debts, and slavery became, and was for many centuries, a form of what we would call bankruptcy. You sell yourself and your family, perhaps, into slavery to pay off your debts. And so the master gives you the money to pay off your debts, and now you serve the master who redeemed you. And you serve him, and your labor then goes to repay what he did in paying off your debts. And you are at his mercy. There's no question that this was an extremely punitive and oppressive form of bankruptcy. And it basically meant that your life as a free person was over, and you were now owned lock, stock, and barrel by another human being, and you were at his mercy. And those relationships were in the church on Sunday morning. Right there in the room, masters and their slaves, listening to the same letter at the same time. So let's look at the passage that Leo read for us. First, we're going to ask a number of questions here. First, a question about power. Who really has power, according to this passage? Slaves, obey your earthly masters, Ephesians 6:5, with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. You are as servants or slaves of Christ, verse 6, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. And you will receive from the Lord, verse 8, whatever good you have done. Who has the power over the slave who believes in Jesus Christ? Christ does. And so Christ becomes the source of power and strength for the slave, and it is an act of faith for the slave to continue in the labor that he or she does. Who has the power over masters? Verse 9. Masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So this master has the power of life and death over the slave, sitting in church with him, and that master has to acknowledge, I have a master, and that master, Christ, died for me. It affects how I relate to my slave, the other slaves. It affects who I am. It changes what I do with my power. So who has the power? Christ does. Secondly, who is really the slave and who is really the master? Well, we start with the slave. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. So this person who, fairly or unfairly, has gotten into debt and has lost his freedom and perhaps the freedom of his family, this person is sitting in church because he has become a Christian and has perhaps led his family to Christianity, or perhaps his master became a Christian and led his entire household to faith in Christ. Now, this raises this to a whole other level of ancient versus modern culture. Individuality, not so much a thing in ancient culture. And so what your household does, you do because you're in the household. So this slave is being told by Paul that all believers submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. So slaves, out of reverence for Christ, you sincerely serve your master. In other words, voluntarily. You give the labor, and you give it from your own voluntary decision. And as you give that labor, you know that the labor is really serving Christ, and He is the source of your power. So, even as I say these words, we can all feel the gospel getting real. This means that there has to be, on the part of a powerless person, an understanding that those who have power need forgiveness for the ways they have abused it. And there has to be a recognition that Jesus has all power, so I'm going to serve Him. I'm going to do what is right, no matter what happens to me. And I'm going to trust God. Now, as everything in you is crying out, that's wrong. That should not be. No one should be asked or commanded to do that. Okay, if that's the standard, then Jesus does not go to the cross. Jesus does not take on the form of a, what's that word? Servant? Slave. The word is slave. Jesus does not take on that form. He does not go to the cross. He does not endure the abuse of the powerful. And He does not lay aside all of His power and become powerless for you. Where does that leave you? Where does that leave me? It leaves us in our sins. Be careful what standards you listen to that are crying out in your heart. And be careful of the implications of those standards. And we need to be careful of this because it affects how we behave when we are powerless. Our temptation when we encounter that professor who is capricious, unreasonable, and won't give you the grades you deserve, is constantly moving the goalposts. When we encounter that supervisor who is constantly demanding things of you that are contradictory and selfish and all of those kinds of things, and has power over you, when we encounter that law enforcement official who has power over you by the force of a gun, quite literally, when we encounter that, this doctrine affects how we respond. It affects how every Christian responds when they are helpless in the situation they find themselves in. What do? Well, we serve Christ with a sincere heart as if we were serving Him directly. Notice the detail that he goes into here, verse 6, not by way of eye service when they're watching, as people pleasers, horizontally making the people around us happy so that we can get away with stuff when they're not looking. He says, you are slaves of Christ. What does that mean in terms of the institution of the time? It means Christ paid your debts, and He now owns you, and you serve Him. You see, it's exactly the same relationship. In the Jewish law and in the ancient world, the institution of slavery in the New Testament becomes, and even in the Old Testament, if truth be told, becomes a picture of the redemptive power of God to save us from our sins, all of us. So, who is really the slave and who is really the master? The slaves have earthly masters, but those masters are just stand-ins for Christ himself. And he gives this promise, verse 8, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. So the powerless in this world have this hope that the good they do sincerely may be ignored here, but it is not ignored in the heavenly places. Christ sees it, and he returns good for good. He is watching. He is the judge. Now, I just want you to notice verse 9. Masters, make sure that they obey you, those slaves, and make sure that they stay subordinate to Christ, and make sure that you teach them the reverent fear that they should have for Christ so that they serve you appropriately and uphold the order of the culture. Is that what you read there? Yeah, it's funny. I don't read that either. I just made that up. And lots of other people did too, using this passage. There is a whole school of Southern theology, as you know, that uses this passage and many others to create a whole theory of race and slavery that was utterly spurious and laughable in its scholarship of the Bible. It doesn't even rise to that level. And villainous in its application. So one of the things we're confronting here is the fact that everything we just read in verses 5 through 8 has been completely abused, as this is the responsibility of masters to make sure your slaves do this. What are the masters to do as they sit in church listening to this letter read out to them from the Apostle Paul? Masters, do the same to them. Well, let's go back then through verses 5 through 8, and let's see what that would mean if the masters actually did it. And many of them did. So here's what it would look like. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. Masters, do the same. Obey your earthly slaves with fear and trembling and with a sincere heart. Rank yourself under your slaves with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by way of eye service, not just when you're in conversation with them and when they're looking. So this is not little bones that you throw them to flatter them or make them feel better so that they'll be more soft-hearted toward you. That's not what this is. This is not eye service pleasing them. You're doing this because Christ is watching. And he's always watching. So you are slaves, masters of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service. What service? Well, you would take that payment, let's say, to free this slave and his family out of their debts, and you would reinterpret that. You would say, that is now service. And so I am going to make it my business to raise up the slaves and free them and set them up back into the economy. Do you know that Deuteronomy actually commands this? Moses says, at the end of the 7 years, when you free your slaves as the law commands you to do, that you are not just to free them and send them on their way, give them an animal, give them clothes, give them food, set them up, launch them, serve them. So masters, do the same to them, rendering service with a good will. So not grudgingly, not mocking them, not begrudging or resenting the fact that I have to use my resources to serve them. No, it's service. It's to Christ. Christ did this for me. So I'm going to do it for those who are in my stewardship. So do the same to them, and know that even if this slave that you're doing this in this way is not respecting you, it doesn't win you the love that you would hope. It wins you disrespect. You look weak. You look like some kind of pushover. Know this. The good you do will be seen by Christ, and those who do that good will receive good from Christ. Do the same to them. And he adds one more detail here. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening. What's a threat? Well, it's that thing that you say that says, I'm going to bring my power down on your head, and I'm going to scare you into doing what I want you to do. That's what a threat is. Stop doing that. Knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. He sees all. He's at the right hand of God. Remember, that's where Ephesians places Christ. He is seated in the heavenly places at the right hand of God. From that position as the judge of all, he sees what you do with your power. So he's watching, and there's no partiality with him. He doesn't care about your wealth. He doesn't care about your position. He doesn't care how many slaves you've got. He's not impressed. He cares that you serve him. Okay. Let's suppose that the masters and slaves in Roman society in Ephesus actually did this. There's an interesting letter you might peruse in the New Testament. It won't take you long. It's about one page. It's called Philemon. It's where Paul calls a rich man in the town of Colossae to do exactly this with a slave who's committed a crime against him. And so it makes for some interesting reading that this was not just something that Paul threw out there. You might think about this. No, if Paul understands that your relationship with your slave is fractured because he committed a crime against you, he's going to have a letter read out in church in Colossae saying, Philemon, you got this slave, and I found him, and he's now your brother in Christ. So if he owes you any money, I'll pay it back. But you take him back into your house, and I know you will, because you're that kind of brother. He makes it a public matter in the life of the church that the master would treat his slave in this way and not harm the slave, which the Romans would say he has every right, even a duty to do, to prevent slave rebellions and all that stuff. So this was not a matter that was taken lightly by the early church. So what if they did this? What would happen to the institution of slavery if masters and slaves started conducting themselves in the household in this manner? It would mean that masters don't need threats because the slaves are serving sincerely. It would mean that slaves don't need to steal and pilfer and kind of slow down their service depending who's watching. It would mean they don't need to do that because their master's on their team in life. it would take away that whole power differential, and it would equalize them before the person of Jesus Christ. And it would gut the institution. Jesus is taking over the world with his power, one relationship at a time. This is not structural yet. Jesus is not going to be in the business of modifying all the structures in our world. He's going to burn them down. He's going to destroy them and establish his own rule with his own kingdom. But this has not happened yet. We are in an oppressive, violent, unjust world. As a question of historical fact, the institution of slavery waned in the Roman Empire. And this became a subject in the classical era, in the 18th century, a subject of some speculation. Why did that happen? And if you're Edward Gibbon, the British historian who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, it took him 5 volumes to describe all of that, if you're that guy, you're going to say this: Christians destroyed the Roman Empire because their ethic took over everything and Rome went soft. And you're going to write 5 volumes documenting how that happened. Or if you're Friedrich Nietzsche, maybe 100 years later, I don't know, 50, 75, I don't know. If you're Nietzsche, you're going to say, it wasn't just the Roman Empire that the Christian slave ethic ruined. It was our entire culture. And what we need is power back in our hands. And we need the Ubermensch, the Superman, to show us what that looks like. Were these passages given by God to establish and support human institutions like slavery? Were the laws in the Old Testament designed to support that institution or to undermine it fatally so that it disappeared? The answer is the latter. And that is, in fact, what happened when it was followed. So we're confronted here with the reality that in America, this was not followed. This was twisted and turned into something utterly different from what the Lord called us to do. And so you ended up with a situation where slaves were being abused sexually by their masters, and then the children that they had with their masters not acknowledged, just re-enslaved. And you had this other reality, which Frederick Douglass describes for us in harrowing detail, of being beaten within an inch of your life by a man, and then that man is your Sunday school teacher on Sunday. They weren't Christianizing anybody. They were just enslaving and raping, and that's all. And so there comes a time when we have to acknowledge forthrightly that this passage and others like it have been ignored by Christians depending upon what was convenient for them. And that we have done that at our peril. We have a judge. We just celebrated his death, and we pocketed the grace. We cannot do that and then withhold grace and goodness from those around us. Can we? Every Christian is going to have to deal with issues of power, and powerlessness. You are going to have power over somebody, and you are going to be powerless under somebody. And how you respond to that affects the way Christ is proclaimed. He is either proclaimed with the integrity of people who actually believe they were bought with a price, or it is proclaimed with the hypocrisy of people who say, not perfect, just forgiven, and go on doing exactly what they did before. The bumper sticker Christianity is not going to fly anymore. We actually have to live this way. And as is so often the case, I am instructed by those who are in the position of powerlessness. I mentioned the men who I was privileged to pastor through their own powerlessness. And I probably spent more hours a week with them, discipling them, reading books with them, coaching them on leadership in the church. Some of them became deacons and were responsible for caring for others. And it was an amazing thing to see how once they embraced this ethic of Jesus has the power, I serve him. And so if this person is abusing me, this parole officer, this minister at the recovery home, whoever it is who's got me in their power, I'm going to serve Jesus and I'm going to receive back from him what I need. It has been a privilege to watch that secret process unfold, where they get jobs and become valued employees, where they get a place to live, where they have a place in the community as leaders, not as slaves, where they are listened to in Bible studies because they're respected, because they're living it out, when they can call their adult daughters and their daughters will pick up and talk to them again, and when they have access to their grandchildren, which access they had lost because they had burned that bridge and blown up that relationship with abusive, addictive behavior. They receive that forgiveness, and those relationships are restored, and life blossoms again in a very dark place. Beloved, the ways we use our power show what we really value. And it is very important that we use our power in relation to Christ, our judge. Because our judge is taking over the world, and he's not going to have any partiality when it comes to us. Let's see what questions we have here. Is it ever justified for people to rebel against oppressive powers, such as, for example, the American colonists against the British Crown? Well, that goes right to the heart of things in this country, doesn't it? I ask myself this question a lot. Would I be on the side of the revolution if I were a pastor in 1776? And that's a very dodgy sort of question to ask, because it assumes, knowing what I know now and having the values that I have now, and then just sort of dropping me in my now condition back in 1776 is not really going to work, is it? So there's something a little false about that, but I'll do it anyway. There's something about the American Revolution that is different. If I can dare to use this word in Ithaca, exceptional. In the American Revolution, we came with a modest view of what the law can accomplish. We said the law can accomplish an imperfect justice. And so we will do justice within the limits that we have. We will come up with ways to make the same laws apply to all the same people. And that took time, didn't it? But that's the project. And so, on balance, I think I would favor that kind of revolution based in law. And if you want to know more of what I think about this, check out my blog, my newsletter. You can get there at the BG website. And I've been writing about these kinds of issues. And I think they are very important. But I think the most important thing is to say something that will offend pretty much everybody. When it comes to giving offense, I believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'll say it this way. Radical claims to human justice are always wrong. Can you do perfect justice for your cause without doing injustice? I don't think you can. I think we need to be modest about what we human beings can accomplish. I think it's vital. I think we're looking at a world where everybody is claiming their right to pursue radical justice against those who have wronged them. And if you are offended, as I am, at the spiral of injustice that is emerging from that, I think we're on the same page. Our justice needs to be modest. Radical justice belongs to one man only. His name is Jesus, and he paid for the right.